I'm not extremely comfortable with this story being told, but nevertheless, I want to share it, but remain anonymous. My dad once shared all his secrets with my brother and me about his childhood. Everything from smoking weed, known as crow in Belvedere, and selling sniff, otherwise known as cocaine. Out of all of his fucked up experiences he shared with us, he said there was only one that truly terrified him. When my dad was 14, he was selling cocaine for his best mate's dad. My dad would go to many crack houses in order to make snuff drop-offs. We call it pickup in the UK. This one guy that bought off him regularly was a full-on cokehead. He wore a dark hoodie all the time and tracksuit bottoms. He would always go into a cafe to pick up off of my dad and would buy him a sausage and chips for being a nice boy. While my dad would be eating the sausage, the man would usually lick his lips and chant the words, "Yeah, you like that sausage, don't ya?" Obviously, my dad was weirded out by this, but he chose to ignore it, get the money, and carry on. On this particular day, the man called him up asking if he could meet him at a local park. My dad agreed and prepared the sniff. He thought this was kind of strange, as the cafe was their main meeting place, so he called up his boss Kane and asked him if he should reschedule for the cafe. Kane said no, but to come over and get a switchblade, just in case the nutcase would try something. My dad insisted that he come with him, and he agreed. He then proceeded to Kane's, grabbed a switchblade, and got in the car to head to the park. In the car, Kane had a fully loaded M9 Beretta, military grade. To this day, my dad doesn't know how he got it. When my dad got to the park, the man was wearing a red hoodie this time, but as he got closer, he noticed that it wasn't a different hoodie. His hoodie now had a lot of red stains, probably blood. My dad took his switchblade out, and Kane was holding his M9 in his pocket. They gave him the sniff and then went home. What bothered my dad was the large red stains, which he was sure was blood. He went to bed unsettled with his day. The next day, he put on the news to find out that 2 known drug dealers were murdered by an unknown killer. Both were 12 to 16 years old, working for a kingpin in Belvedere, and a large trace of cocaine was found at the scene. I can't provide any proof of this happening, as it was in the 1960s in England. There was no internet at the time. You can only take my word for it that it is true. I can't help but feel that if my dad hadn't called Kane that day, he might have been killed as well, and I'm thankful that he was so cautious. Since back then Belvedere was one of the most fucked up places in all of London, all I can say is that this sniffhead was a total nutcase. I am thankful my dad stopped drug dealing after the news of the story showed on TV. My name is Gillian. I'm 32, from England, and this incident took place around 12 years ago. I live in a small town just on the outskirts of London. I went to a good school and was raised around good influences. I had recently moved back to my parents' house and had signed up with an agency for work, and they sent me to a popular cell phone store to cover a shortage of employees. The staff there was great. My manager was awesome, and I loved learning about the newest and top-of-the-line phones. The only downside was that it was a bus ride and then 2 train rides away. The travel time was about 45 minutes in the opposite direction of London, but it was all the waiting around between transfers that sucked. I'd been making this journey back and forth for a few months now, and had upgraded my phone to one that had an MP3 player. I always had my headphones on, kept myself to myself, but smiled if I happened to make eye contact with anyone. And before that day, I hadn't had any problems. It had been a long, busy day, and after a short staff meeting, I found that I had already missed 2 trains. It was a pretty warm day, so I didn't mind too much. I arrived at the station and didn't have to wait long for the next train. There weren't too many people around, and usually everyone heads for the carriage with the most people, so naturally, I followed the herd. I arrive at my halfway point for the transfer, and this was going to be a 35-minute wait for the next train. I made my way to the platform to find myself with 2 other people waiting. I sat on a bench in the shade and shuffled through my songs on my phone. There was some kid by the vending machine, and further down the line was a young man. He was slowly pacing in the sunlight, looking down at his shoes. I could barely focus on him, so I paid him no attention. 5 minutes passed, and the train finally pulled up, the doors opened, and the herds make their way to the exit. I continue to look down at my phone until the crowd clears. Then I look up. The kid that was standing by the vending machine was gone. I looked down the track to see if the man was still there, but I saw nothing. Feeling quite alone, I start confidently humming to myself. I was about to break into a full concert when the man appeared around the corner. I laughed at myself for getting spooked and smiled at him. The sun was setting right behind him, and I had to shield my eyes. "Hey," I said. He was wearing clean white Nikes and a white tracksuit, with navy blue stripes. It took a second for my eyes to adjust before I could make eye contact with him. He appeared to be an Indian man in his early 20s. He had piercing dark eyes and floppy hair. He was quite handsome, too. He made no reply, or maybe he did and I just didn't hear him, but he took off wandering down the platform before I could take off my headphones. The door to the train would remain closed for a few minutes. It was the last stop, so they had to clean up, and the driver switches carriages. I got up to stretch my legs, and I noticed the man looking over at me. So again, I smile. I start walking in the opposite direction, towards the vending machine. My stomach is starting to chew a hole in itself, so I load up on some of the snacks. I fill my pockets and turn around. There he is. That man again, leaning against the wall and staring at me. Now I'm standing there, staring straight back with my eyebrows raised. I slide my headphones off and smile again. "Can I help you?" I say confidently. At first, I thought maybe he's lost. Then I thought, maybe he doesn't speak English, or maybe he's a foreign exchange student. He didn't respond. "Are you okay?" Again, nothing. He remained completely expressionless. I took a step forward, and he took a step backward, turned, and then vanished behind the wall. Maybe he's just shy, I thought. I waited a moment so he could make a clean escape, then made my way back to the bench. I looked down the line, and he was gone again. He must have been around the corner. Out of sight, out of mind. I put my headphones back on and continued to mind my own business. That's when I noticed some movement from the direction of the vending machines. I casually glance over, and there he is again, staring directly at me. Now I just look away. If he wants to come over and talk, then that's on him. I've been friendly, and that's all I can do. But he doesn't come over. He doesn't do anything. He just continued to stand there staring. Just 15 minutes before the train is due to leave, and this guy is starting to make me feel awkward. I got up and strolled down the platform. The sky was all shades of orange and red. I keep my wits about me, glancing down the tracks in his direction. Each time he had moved, inched his way closer, all the while staring at me. The doors finally open, and I felt relieved. I waited to see which carriage he went into so I could pick the one furthest away. I waited, but he would not get on the train. He was waiting for me to make the first move. I began to feel really uneasy. I looked up at the clock. 4 minutes before the doors close. In 4 minutes I'm going to be trapped inside an empty train carriage with this creep, and missing the train wasn't an option. I walked down the platform, straight past him, and into the nearest carriage. I sat down in the seat closest to the door, and waited. Sure enough, he followed me inside and took a seat. As soon as his ass made contact with the sponge, I stood straight up and bolted out the door, and I walked swiftly to the first carriage and took a seat. "Not today, asshole," I said to myself. Seconds after I took my seat, the door closes and the train begins to move. I started feeling a little bad, but much more at ease. My phone battery was pretty low, so I no longer had my headphones on. I just leaned back in my seat and tried to enjoy the countryside view. A moment or so passed, and then I heard the long, loud screech of the door hinge from the back of the carriage. I froze in absolute fear. He walked straight by me and sat in front of me about 5 or 6 rows away. He looked back over his shoulder and stared right at me at that moment. Every horrid scenario played through my mind. He looked away, and I started to panic. I looked straight out the window. My heart was racing, and I kept telling myself that I was being stupid. The train pulled into the station, and I could barely breathe. I was praying that someone else would get on, but no one did. The station was completely empty. As the doors close, he looks back over his shoulder again, but this time, he was smirking. He was starting to look like an escaped mental patient, and I was about ready to piss my pants. I was so scared. I opened my purse and I started to look for anything that I could use in self-defense, aside from a bunch of keys. I had absolutely nothing. I lined my palm with a Kleenex and held my keys so that they poked through my fingers when I balled up my fist. Although my phone was top of the line at the time, I was on a pay-as-you-go plan and I was out of credit. And even if I had credit, there was no signal out in the countryside. I noticed him glance over a few times, but I made no eye contact. We were approaching another station, and I started praying that he would get off the train. But again, he didn't. And again, nobody got on. There is one more stop before my station, and all I can do is wait and see what happens. Nothing will happen. It's all in your head. Just ignore him and he'll go away, I tried to convince myself. He continued to look over his shoulder, grinning now like the Cheshire Cat. There was no way he didn't pick up on how uncomfortable I was. No doubt that he could see that I was physically shaking. This is not a good person. This man wishes to do me wrong. It was at this point that I started to get really pissed off. I was going to put a stop to this shit right now. He had looked away again, and I pulled out my phone. I turned on the camera and pointed it in his direction, and I waited, my keys still clenched in my other hand. I started to take slow, deep breaths, staring into the back of his head. Slowly, he turned around and made eye contact with me. The flash from my camera lit up the train carriage, and he quickly turned his head and looked down. I spoke out loud, almost shouting to be heard over the train. "Now you've done it, mate. I've just sent your picture to everyone in my phone book. They're gonna be waiting for you at my station. You're really fucked now." He started shifting in his seat upon hearing this. I quickly saved his blurry picture in a draft text titled, "This is the guy that killed me." Over dramatic? Maybe. But never in my life had anyone made me feel so unnerved. And I wasn't about to wait and find out where this was going. And I wasn't going to go down easy. I began to taunt him. "I'd get the fuck off this train if I were you. I wouldn't want them to get a hold of you." I couldn't believe it. I was snarling at this man. I went full on crazy bitch. He didn't turn around again, and by then my phone had fully died. As the train pulled into the station, he stood up and left, staring at me as he walked by. I stared right back. I started to believe my own bullshit, like I actually had this giant squad waiting to kick his ass. "I wish you'd fucking stay," I said as I glared at him while the doors closed and the train pulled away from the station. I watched him until he was out of sight, and then I just lost it. I cried all the way home. I felt like an awful person for screaming at this stranger, but I do feel like my day might not have ended well had I not activated that crazy bitch card. If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. If you would like a chance to have your story featured in an upcoming video, make sure you check the description for information on how to submit your stories. Sorry this video didn't make it out yesterday. For some reason everyone decided to drive by every time I tried to record, so I had to wait till later. It also probably didn't help that I spent about 20 hours trying to get that 100,000K special ready, both of those videos. Like to the point I actually came in, recorded a video, went out with the audio, told my wife to edit it, and then I came back in and started recording all over again. 20 hours later, we actually got it all done. So I hope you all enjoyed it, as well as this video. I hope you all have a great day, and I'll catch you in the next video. And just remember, it's always scarier if it's true. This is a story from when I was about 5 or 6. I don't really remember much of what happened, and had to get my mom to tell me parts. We live in England, near a busy road, and I still live in that house today. My mom would always finish work at around 4, and I was in year 1, so she could never pick me up for school, so she had the neighbor's son, who was 18, pick me up, and my mom paid him £5 for doing so. My mom told me she first knew something strange was happening when she would hear me alone in my room laughing, and whenever she'd open the door, I would be at the window. She thought I was just being silly, and told me to go to bed. What she didn't know was that the boy from next door was at the window watching me. What creeps me out to this day is that he used to tell me to pull up my nightie and dance for him. I didn't understand at the time what was happening, so I did, which makes me sick. About 4 years pass, and I was 8. He would try to get me to do it again, but I would say no, because at this time I knew it wasn't right. That got him angry, and the horrible thing is that my mom then had him babysit, not knowing anything was up. He would always tickle me and come into the bathroom every time I went to go wee, because my mom didn't have a lock on the door. I had a bigger brother and sister, but they would go to sleepovers every time my mom and dad went out. My parents would always say they were too old for babysitters. We moved to Cyprus for 2 years, as my dad was in the army, but then we moved back. Sadly, he lived with his mom and had never had a real job at all. I was now 10 and was dumb, and still didn't tell my mom about all that happened before we moved away. They came over for dinner one night, and I remember him saying, "I've missed being your babysitter, Liv." My tummy felt like it caved in, and I felt sick. Weeks passed, and I had to go to their house to get my mom's slow cooker back, as she told them they could borrow it when we were away. I was scared to go into that house, but I did. I knocked on the door, and he answered. He let me in and he said he would go get it for me. He acted very normal about the whole thing. He put it in my hands and went to the door. However, he didn't open the door. He locked it. I was freaking out, and I dropped the slow cooker as he said, "Let's make up for them 2 years." He tried grabbing me, but I ran through his back door and ran through the bushes back to my house. I told my mom this time, and she called the police. But, without any proof, they couldn't do anything. But, his mom soon kicked him out after hearing what went on. I am 16 now, and soon going to college to do art, and I am really hoping that all of this is behind me now. So this last bonus story, I actually wanted to throw this in, even though it's a little bit different than what I would normally do. The reason being is because it's very important that children know to talk to their parents about this sort of thing, as well as the parents to look for the signs. There was actually a time years and years ago when I was 18, and I took my daughter to a babysitter that was recommended through the state, the actual government office. It wasn't until a few months after that we started to notice something was off with our daughter. She started crying a lot whenever she wasn't at the babysitter, which alone wasn't a red flag because she was a baby. But then we started noticing her medication disappearing out of her diaper bag, the baby Tylenol PM to be more precise. Upon further investigation, we actually found out that this babysitter was drugging our daughter. This one example may be a little bit different than the story, but I've also gone through things similar to the story, maybe even a little deeper. So I feel it necessary to at least put out a warning to children to don't be afraid to talk to your parents about anything that might be wrong. Even anything you're not really quite sure of, at least bring it up to your parents and let them be the deciding factor. And to the parents, don't be afraid to ask your children questions, because sometimes it's up to you to try to get the information to keep them safe. I really appreciate you watching this video, and I'll catch you in the next one.